Hello, good morning. So what were we doing in the last class? Talking about India-Sri Lanka relations. Okay, what has happened? Class is not running live? Okay, we'll wait for a while to start the class. We can have a conversation. Right. Now, when we were talking about India-Sri Lanka relations in the last class, no voice? Okay, voice is there. To the online students, we are back. Kindly unmute, no voice. Is there still a problem? So I guess that there is no problem from our end. You can unmute your system if at all that is the problem. Voice is not audible. Subtitle bhi nahi hai niche. I am not audible. A lot of people are saying that I am not audible. Okay. Now it's working. Now abhi fine hai. Chalo. There is always a lag, right? There is always a lag. We have not yet reached the generation of 5G. So there is always latency. So patience is the virtue. In the examination, in life, being patient is important. So sooner or later things fall in place. So now things are fine. Everybody is saying things are fine. So let's start talking. You are now audible. Thank you. So we were talking about India-Sri Lanka relations in the last class. And again, as we have been doing, we have been talking about the neighborhood. We understand the neighborhood is important for India because many times what we do is we talk about India's foreign policy in terms of concentric circles. Meaning there is a large world, what is important for India in order of priority. So the first circle of the concentric circles of India's foreign policy is India's neighborhood. So we had talked about land-based neighbor and we realized that with most of them, the way of dealing with them is similar. So any subject after a time start repeating itself, right? There is a lot of repetition in the UPSC examination. When you write the mains examination, you would have a feeling that you are writing same things in all the answers. So it happens when you are basically writing the examination. But that is the trend. There is nothing to worry about. There is no new information. तो क्या होता है कि जब आप प्रिपरेशन करने आते हैं तो एक एक्सपेक्टेशन होती है कि आईएएस का एग्जाम है और लोग ऐसे बताते भी ना शॉर्ट्स में आईएएस है ये आईएएस ऐसे नहीं निकलता ऑलराइट तो ऐसे तो आईआईटी भी नहीं निकलता ऐसे तो बोर्ड का एग्जाम भी आप पास नहीं होते तो वो एक हाइप करने का तरीका है बट जनरली द डिफिकल्टी इन दिस एग्जामिनेशन लेट मी टेल यू कम्स फ्रॉम द कॉम्पिटिशन ऑलराइट एवरी ईयर देयर आर ओनली 800 सीट्स and 500,000 students at least are writing the examination. A million students are filling the form. I remember a time when at most 50,000 students would be filling the form, 40,000 people would be writing. So those were good old days. Hai na? So that is where the difficulty comes from, not from the subject matter. So organize yourself and keep doing the same thing repeatedly. That is what is required in this examination. It's a very boring examination. It's a very boring examination. Without getting bored, you are not going to get I have not said that you are not going to get selected. All of you are going to get selected. But it is a boring examination, right? Because things repeat. After a while, things repeat. So, बीच-बीच में लोग मुझे वो भी देते रहते हैं, support भी देते रहते हैं, yes बोल के. So then when we are talking about India-Sri Lanka relations, those factors that we had earlier talked about is also relevant. For example, we said it is a relationship based on cultural and civilizational linkages. So that simply means that you should be aware of what is the component of that cultural and civilizational linkages that we are talking about. But that's a valid point. And then we said that in this relationship, economy and development is an important part. So there again, what we need to know is, A, what is the status of trade? So for example, 2020, we had a trade of 3.6 billion US dollars. India and Sri Lanka had a trade of 3.6 billion US dollars in 2020. But prior to that, we have reached to the trade level of around 6 billion US dollars. And the trend has been that India traditionally has been largest trading partner of Sri Lanka. But that trend does not hold always in all the years. So there are differences, but majorly the pattern is this. And we also understand what brings a specificity to this trade relation is the fact that India and Sri Lanka signed the free trade agreement in 2000. So that was the first free trade agreement that India signed with any of the South Asian countries. So these are the facts in this relation. And then we said that whenever it comes to our neighbors, since most of them are economically, all of them are economically least developed or developing countries, smaller economies than India's, then development partnership becomes important. So development partnership again with Sri Lanka has reached to around $3 billion of India's commitment, right? Anywhere between 2.6 to $3 billion of India's commitment to Sri Lanka. And it has primarily resulted into certain kinds of projects. What are the kinds of projects that India has built in Sri Lanka? 50,000 housing units for internally displaced people. So again, we are stating the fact, we are stating some examples. That's what we try and do in the examination, right? Once we understand what are the areas of cooperation. So thereby, India's efforts to strengthen its relations with the neighbors is always multi-pronged. It has multiple aspects. And in some relations, there may be issues which are more difficult than the others. So in India-Sri Lanka relations, what is the issue that we see persistently has featured as an issue of friction or concern? What is the issue? Hambantota Port. Hambantota Port to पहुंचे भी नहीं अभी हम. The issue of ethnic linkages in the form of the treatment of Tamil people in Sri Lanka. That's something that is a persistent issue, and in any phase, unless there is a satisfactory solution, until there is a satisfactory solution to the problems of Tamil rights in Sri Lanka, this would always be an issue in the relation. So thereby, what is India's position on that? Could anyone recount India's position on the Sri Lankan Tamil issue? ऐसा कोई है जो बता सके what is India's position? So that is something that you should be aware of. What is India's position on the Sri Lankan Tamil issue? Yes. हाँ, बहुत बढ़िया, आप सही बोल रहे हैं. अब उसमें that दो तीन बार है, उसको बस हटाना है. आप सही बोल रहे हैं. That is the position. So first of all, due to common shared ethnic linkages, the issue of Sri Lankan Tamils and their treatment in Sri Lanka has always featured as a consideration in India's foreign policy. Number one, because we have a shared ethnic linkage, and there is an issue of the treatment of Tamils in Sri Lanka. So independent India's foreign policy has always contended with that question. But independent India also stands for certain principles, certain values. We ourselves say that there should be, in relations between countries, respect for sovereignty, respect for territorial integrity, non-interference. So then, how do we address this issue without violating our principles? So any problem anywhere in the world, first of all, for India would be addressed through principles. There is no question that there would be no principles when India is dealing with any particular issue. That is the kind of country we are, and generally countries talk about principles, ideals. So when it comes to Sri Lanka, India would like the situation of Sri Lankan Tamils to improve in terms of their rights. Thereby, what India advised or advises or has advised to the government of Sri Lanka is a solution within the constitutional framework of Sri Lanka that particularly translated into, what is the particular example of that? That particularly translated into the India-Sri Lanka Peace Accords of, किस साल में साइन हुआ था? 1987. And the elements within the 1987 Peace Accords as solution is the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment talks about devolution of power to provinces, greater recognition of cultural rights of the Tamil people, merger of northern and eastern provinces. That is what India says, that the solution should be within the constitutional framework of Sri Lanka. India does not support any solution which questions the sovereignty or territorial integrity of Sri Lanka, so there is no question of supporting any extremist group. India has also supported periodically Sri Lankan government's right to take action against terrorist elements. So that is another step. that India has taken. So that is what India expects. So generally, whenever there would be a meeting, as I told you in the last class also, India would even now suggest that there should be implementation of 13th Amendment. So that is a process which is as yet incomplete. So we believe that that is the solution. Now, moving forward, when we look at India-Sri Lanka relations, the ethnic issue in some ways is still relevant. In what sense? In what particular sense? So there may be a history of an issue. So that's why 1987 India-Sri Lanka Peace Accord, Operation Pawan, IPKF, they all become part of what is called post-independence history. But then these linkages play out in the modern relations. So we have the issue of the fishermen issue in India-Sri Lanka relation. It has a reflection of the ethnic linkages. So what is this issue all about? सुना है आपने? क्या है? Yes बोला कुछ लोगों ने? Right. There are arrests of Indian fishermen. Yes. What else? What else? सुना है आपने? आपने भी सुना है? क्या बताइए? वाटर्स, टेरिटोरियल वाटर्स, पानी के हैं यहाँ पे, है ना? टेरिटरी में नहीं जा रहे हैं, मेन आइलैंड में नहीं जा रहे, बट इन दी ओशंस. बट यस, बोथ ऑफ यू आर correct in your own ways, right? That's why we have different kinds of toppers in this examination. कहानी सबको पता है, right? Now, so when we look at this particular issue, we need to understand that what are the basic facts? That India and Sri Lanka demarcated what? Demarcated their maritime boundary in 1974. So that's one, demarcated their maritime boundary in 1974. So there is no maritime boundary issue between India and Sri Lanka as such. They demarcated it. And then they reinforced the monitoring of their respective maritime domains through an exchange of letter in 1976. जिन्होंने भी content पढ़ा है उनको पता होगा. Exchange of letters in 1976. And this exchange of letters, apart from other things, prohibited fishing by their fishermen, in each other's waters. Meaning they specifically noticed that there is a tendency of fishermen to cross over the maritime boundary and fish in the waters of the other country. So they sought to prohibit it by signing a agreement, and then they exchange a letter. बहुत सालों तक सब ठीक रहा. Why? Because these waters were not safe. Because the LTT rose, LTT had tic-tac naval capabilities, right? Reasonable naval capabilities. So LTT was active in this water. Sri Lankan Navy was also active in this water. So security situation prevented extensive fishing in this particular region for a very long time. Then what happened? When did the civil war in Sri Lanka ended? 2009, the civil war in Sri Lanka ended. So then after that, what we find is that there are particular kinds of instances which are taking place. So generally in recent times what we see is there are few issues. For example, you find arrest of Indian fishermen. So Indian fishermen are arrested by Sri Lankan authorities because they are crossing over the maritime boundary. Then there is also complaint about confiscation of boats of Indian fishermen. And then there are also reports of firing at and killing of Indian fishermen or deaths of Indian fishermen by this firing. So that is also being reported. So from India's perspective, the issue of fishermen involves instances of or complaints about arrest of Indian fishermen. So a lot of Indian fishermen are in the Sri Lankan jails, confiscation of their boats, and then issue becomes serious when there are reports of killing of Indian fishermen when security forces fire upon them, right? So that is the issue. Now what is the issue from the Sri Lankan side? So from the Sri Lankan side, the issue is Sri Lanka complains of violation of maritime boundary, right? That Indian fishermen are violating its maritime boundary. It then also complains that these fishermen ultimately are encroaching upon the livelihood of Sri Lankan fishermen because they are fishing in the areas where Sri Lankan fishermen should be fishing. So they are raising the issue of encroachment upon the livelihood of the Sri Lankan fishermen. And they also complained about the practice of bottom trawling. All right, that the Indian fishermen use heavy metal nets to dredge the surface of the Pak Bay, and this issue mainly is significant in the Pak Bay region. So I had suggested you go back, revise your Bay, Gulf, right, and straight the conception geography क्योंकि आप पढ़ चुके हैं. I hope you did that, right? I had simply addressed that issue as an issue of correlation कि जब आपको कोई concept नजर आता है किसी और discipline का mention होगा IR में, but if you are aware of it, it would be better, right? So what is happening? That practice of bottom trawling is complained against by Sri Lankan side. Now, why is bottom trawling detrimental? Bottom trawling is considered to be environmentally detrimental, right? Environmentally detrimental. So, if you see this region called the Pak Bay region, the Pak Bay region is a shallow part of the ocean. Why? Because on all sides it is surrounded by land. So ocean currents are weaker here. So you have a shallow body of water, right? Now that's why there is limited catch available here, right? The fishing stock is limited here. So सबके लिए पर्याप्त नहीं है, not sufficient for everyone. And also when you engage in bottom trawling, what is happening is a practice like bottom trawling does not discriminate between species profile or the age profile of the population. So that means that if this practice continues soon, there would be no fishing stock left to fish in this particular region. So it basically destroys the fishing stock available in this particular region. And apart from that, कई बार ऐसा होता है ना कि if you watch programs related with fishing, that fishermen want to catch a particular species, but they also catch another species. बहुत लंबे समय तक on western coast of India, on the Gujarat coast of India, there was a species, a wonderful, magnificent species called shark, whale shark. Whale shark सुना है आपने? It's a large, magnificent, beautiful fish. So it used to get caught in the nets of the Indian fishermen. और फिर उसका क्या करेंगे? It has no significant commercial value. So that poor creature was being killed as a collateral damage because fishermen wanted to catch commercially viable species, not the whale shark. So then after that there was activism, right? Environmental activists created awareness among fishermen. Fishermen agreed to not catch the whale shark, release it, and Government of India banned the fishing of whale shark. So this is something that happens, it becomes a concern. So in this case here, we are talking about bottom trawling being environmentally detrimental for the ecological profile, biodiversity of this particular region. So it's an environmental concern also. Now, what is the solution? So generally these kinds of issues, whenever something like this happens, especially killing of Indian fishermen, if it is reported, Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu would always write a letter to the union government raising this particular issue, and Government of India raises this particular issue with the government of Sri Lanka, right? So there, what you would find is that there are already measures taken by the government. So for example, in 2016, Government of India and Government of Sri Lanka constituted a joint working group to satisfactorily address the concerns regarding fishing. So a joint working group on cooperation in the issue of fisheries was constituted by both the governments, and they decided that this is the platform where the issues would be sufficiently addressed. Generally, what you would see is some solutions are visible. For example, on Sri Lanka's demand on bottom trawling, Government of India has assured, when Sri Lanka demands that bottom trawling should be discontinued, Government of India has done what? It has assured that it would phase out bottom trawling. Bottom trawling is already banned on the Sri Lankan side. So Government of India on this matter agrees with Government of Sri Lanka, and it has said that it would phase out bottom trawling. So that is something that is already a solution. It is there. On one issue, we agree that bottom trawling needs to be phased out. So that is something that we have assured. Right? Now, what other solutions can be discussed? What other solutions are available there? So in this examination, you are always thinking about solving rather than raising questions. Right? इसलिए बहुत सारे लोगों को बहुत मजा नहीं आता क्योंकि बहुत प्रॉब्लम की बात नहीं हो रही थी. Exam is about solving problems. Even if you become a bureaucrat, no, very few people like bureaucrats who question a lot. Bureaucracy में आपको बात माननी है. Senior हैं तो sir हैं, उनकी बात माननी है. Right? So ultimately, in life, people don't like people who always raise problems. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. Raising problem is equally important. But in bureaucracy, of course, in the examination also, more than raising problems, identifying the problem, but solve it. So how do you solve it? What kind of solutions are available? क्या सोच सकते हैं? क्या हो सकता है? सोचो, you have been given the opportunity to solve this problem. What would you advise the Government of India? What should be the course of action? आप ethics की case study भी लिखेंगे, वहाँ पे भी आप बड़ी-बड़ी बातें करेंगे to resolve world problems, right? Bureaucratic problems. So what would be the solution? You tell me. Create a greater awareness among fishermen, right? That is a good solution. आप बताइए. हाँ? Boundary certain करना है. Boundary यहाँ पे certain करना थोड़ा मुश्किल होगा. Floating devices are there, but आप समुद्र में लकीर तो खींच नहीं सकते, right? But हाँ, that is also right. That there should be some provision for adequate monitoring. ऐसा कह देते हैं. Access of technology to the fishermen. Now I am coming to the point. You have read the material. I like that whenever people do that. So you are all right. So basically see what you are doing. One is the solution coming from the people. Another is the solution that can be done at the official level. Another is the solution that is the infusion of technology. That is what I am trying to point out. That you, if you are thinking, think of multiple solutions. So first of all, what government can do? So a better monitoring and patrolling. Better monitoring and patrolling of the Park Bay region. All right? By both sides. They can also do it jointly. So if government forces are present there, they can warn off the fishermen if they are straying onto the other side. So better patrolling, better monitoring of the maritime boundary in the Pak Bay region, because this issue is prominently in the Pak Bay region. What else can be done? So now we can think about provisions such as fishing quotas, meaning both sides can discuss mechanisms where they allow some sort of joint fishing. They allow fishing, they determine quotas, right? Days, for example, on some days fishing is allowed, on some days fishing is not allowed, because immediately you cannot discontinue this practice. So fishing quotas can be determined. Then what else can be done? A dialogue and engagement between whom? Between the fishing community, the fishermen community on both sides. Meaning, let these communities be aware of the issues, let them become the stakeholders. We can also, if the government wants, promote some sort of cooperative arrangements, that catch is jointly marketed. All right, that Indian fishermen and Sri Lankan fishermen form some sort of a cooperative, and then what happens? There is the catch which is done jointly. This catch is then marketed and then profits are distributed. So there is game theory. In game theory, there is zero sum game. Suna hai aapne zero sum game? Zero sum game means what? In simple terms, whenever there is a question, the answer is always that if one wins, then two loses. है ना? जैसे cricket के matches is a zero sum game. One wins, another loses. Right? That is something that would happen. But not always. There is tie and there is draw also. तो solution ये है कि you make issues into non-zero sum games, which means increase the win set, which means try and find out solutions where both sides win. Win-win solution, जिसको कहते हैं. Win-win solution. So win-win solution can be looking at this whole region and then deciding that maybe engaging the fishing community, improving cooperation between them can lead to solutions like cooperative arrangements for fishing, for distribution of fisheries catch. Right? That is something that can be done. On Indian side, what we can done is capacity building of Indian fishermen. Capacity building for multi-day deep sea fishing. So that is something that can be done. Government in any case runs a lot of welfare schemes for different communities. Currently, we are not under any obligation to not give subsidies to fishermen, right? WTO discussed the issue of subsidies to fisheries. So there is no prohibition there. So we may think of incentivizing the fishermen to fish away from the Pak Bay region. कैसे उनको Pak Bay region से आगे जाके fishing करने के लिए promote करें. Pak Bay region is a shallow body of water. So people living on the coast traditionally in artisanal way, in very interesting ways, have been fishing in these waters. So some of these fishermen are accustomed to fishing in these waters. Some of these fishermen are fishing at a very small level, so that is not an issue. Some of these fishermen which are fishing at a large scale do not have the capability to go and fish in the deeper waters. Right? So remember, there is a boundary in the Pak Bay region, but there is also Gulf of Mannar and there is also Bay of Bengal. So fishermen in this region may be fishing excessively because they don't have the boats, the equipments to go and fish in deeper waters. है ना? So then you can incentivize capacity building for multi-day fishing. When fishermen are going to deeper seas, they are staying there. Fishing boats are staying there and they fish there. Right? So deep sea fishing can be promoted, and that there government needs to build the capacity, technological capacity, better boats. And then there is another way in which technology can play a role equipping the boats with monitoring devices. Equipping the boats with monitoring devices. That is something that can be done. That fishermen at times may not know that they are crossing the maritime boundary. So if you make them aware that they are crossing the boundary by equipping the boats with monitoring devices, that can also be a solution, right? A range of solution. So these are the range of solutions that you can think of, right? What governments can do. Governments can monitor the waters better, can issue warnings when fishermen are crossing over to the other side. They can promote cooperation, they can decide fishing quotas, different days for fishing, right? So that Sri Lankan fishermen, Indian fishermen both are allowed to fish. They can promote some sort of cooperation between the fishing community, creating awareness among them, creating a dialogue between them, and that may lead to cooperative solutions like joint fishing and then joint marketing. That may happen, right? Then on Indian side, we have to work towards capacity building of our fishermen so that they can be incentivized to move into deeper waters. वहाँ पे problem नहीं है. So go and fish in Bay of Bengal, go and fish towards the Gulf of Mannar, towards the Arabian Sea, right? That is something that can be done. And then their boats can be equipped with monitoring devices so that they are aware that they are crossing over to the other side. So this is the range of solution that you can talk about. But in simple terms, the solution also tells you why the fishermen generally are fishing in this area. Why are the fishermen fishing in this area? The reasons are A, traditionally they have been fishing in this area, so they are accustomed to fishing in this area. For thousands of years maybe they are fishing in this particular area. Traditionally they have been fishing in this area. Secondly, you understand that many of these fishermen lack multi-day fishing capabilities. Many of these fishermen lack multi-day deep sea fishing capabilities. So that is another reason why this is happening, right? And then thirdly, lack of awareness of the exact location of maritime boundary. That is why it is happening, rather than out of any particular desire to encroach upon the boundary of the other country. And then interestingly, many people, especially for example members of parliament from Tamil Nadu, have raised the issue of Kachativu, right? The Kachativu islets. So as part of India-Sri Lanka maritime boundary demarcation, it is very clear that Kachativu islets belong to Sri Lanka, right? They are on the Sri Lankan side. But for centuries, fishermen from India, and when we say fishermen from India, of course, a fisherman from Madhya Pradesh is not going there. Fishermen from Tamil Nadu have been accustomed to drying their nets resting at the islet of Kachativu. It was uninhabited. So then when the island on the demarcation of the boundary fell on the Sri Lankan side, well, there was a lack of awareness and Indian fishermen kept on doing that, right? Many still think that Kachativu should belong to India. But since it is a sovereign decision, we have a treaty, we have an agreement, Kachativu was on the side of Sri Lanka, so that is not a tenable solution. So some people ask me, can we take back Kachativu from Sri Lanka? Of course, those demands have been raised in the parliament by honorable MPs from Tamil Nadu. But at best, what we can say is that we can consider leasing Kachativu from Sri Lanka. Leasing, rather than saying कि boundary determine हो गई, अब वो हमको पसंद नहीं आ रही, वो Kachativu should belong to us. So Kachativu can be leased from Sri Lanka. That is, those of you who want to have that kind of a solution can add that solution, right? The idea of leasing out Kachativu from Sri Lanka, close to the maritime boundary, the Kachativu islets, and that's why the fishermen use that island to dry their nets or to rest, right? So that is something that can be resolved amicably. And why is there an ethnic element here? Because the sentiments are always high in Tamil Nadu about the activities of Sri Lankan government. Right? So it is perceived to be an attack by the Sri Lankan government on the Tamils in other ways. So that's why this issue is a bilateral issue which is being addressed at a particular level. But then there are also emotive issues, there are also issues of practicality that we should keep in mind. Right? Shashwat says providing fishing community alternate livelihood options by skilling them. That can also be done. You can add it to capacity building, right? Or providing them alternatives for livelihood in other areas, right? That can also be a solution. So you have solved a big problem. Adishwar says, why not think something like fishermen markets being organized by India on both sides, fishermen where all countries can come. Bhai, this is what I said, Adishwar. Yeah, dialogue and engagement between fishing community that may lead to cooperative arrangements. Right? चलिए हो गया ये कच्चा तिवु. Right? So then this is one issue on which there may be a question in the examination in the nature of the current issues between India and Sri Lanka still remains unresolved, but never forget both the governments are engaging with each other on this particular issue. Right? Moving forward, what we can look at in India-Sri Lanka relations are the issues which are of strategic concerns or issues which are strategic in nature, right? So first of all, when it comes to defense and security cooperation between India and Sri Lanka, you cannot miss this. Every document would be talking about it. Defense and security cooperation between India and Sri Lanka. Right. So, then what we see is, first of all, there are in any relationship certain common issues. So, why cooperation with Sri Lanka is important? First of all, cooperation with Sri Lanka is important in terms of maritime security. So, ensuring regional maritime security in the Indian Ocean region requires close cooperation between India and Sri Lanka. What does maritime security mean? Security or safety of sea lanes of communication, or security and safety of trade routes. Right? Sri Lanka is strategically located. Colombo port is a strategically located port. So this means when we are talking about maritime security, we are talking about a lot of things. We are talking about how the commercial vessels are safe, right? Seafaring community is safe. How when there is a naval movement that is safe, there is adequate provision for supplies, relief, replenishment. And we can also think of situations where the issues may not be traditional. For example, cooperation in HADR, which is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. That is where also cooperation with Sri Lanka is important. So that's why Sri Lanka becomes important from the perspective of maintaining regional security, specifically maritime security, close to India's coast. Right? Similarly, Sri Lanka is an important country when it comes to the coastal security consideration of India. Right? Coastal security would be part of internal security, maritime security would be part of external security. Right? So this is why Sri Lanka is important. Then we have common issues like terrorism. So both sides have common concerns. India has its own concerns on terrorism. For India, it's a no-brainer that terrorism is an important issue. For Sri Lanka also. For example, the activities of LTTE in the earlier period, right? That was one example of how Sri Lanka also faced terrorism. Most importantly, this issue became important in the context of 2019 Easter bombings, right? So in the month of April in 2019, multiple bomb blasts took place in the capital of Sri Lanka, Colombo, in churches and hotels. So Easter bombings in 2019 clearly highlighted that India and Sri Lanka should cooperate in terrorism, and there was a cooperation NIA had helped Sri Lankan authorities in nabbing some of the culprits involved in the incident of terrorism. So that is always there. So this cooperation is there. Thereby, in 2019, Prime Minister visited Sri Lanka, and on that occasion, apart from expressing the solidarity of Indian people with the people of Sri Lanka on terrorism, he announced a 50 million US dollars of support to Sri Lanka for counter-terrorism capacity building, right? So India provided financial assistance to build Sri Lanka's capacity to combat terrorism. 50 million US dollars of assistance by India to Sri Lanka. Similarly, what you would see is when it comes to maritime and coastal security, India also focuses on capacity building of Sri Lanka. So what is the example? So India is helping Sri Lanka in developing or installing coastal, at least this is the plan, coastal surveillance radar. So Sri Lanka is part of India's plan of capacity building of the Indian Ocean region countries by installing coastal surveillance radars there. So this would aid Sri Lanka's capacity to adequately monitor its surroundings, but this would also be helpful to India. Similarly, if you are reading newspaper, what happened? India has recently provided Dornier surveillance aircraft to Sri Lanka. तो ये एग्जाम्पल कैसा हो गया? कैपेसिटी बिल्डिंग का हो गया, दैट इंडिया इज हेल्पिंग श्रीलंका इन कैपेसिटी बिल्डिंग. सो डोर्नियर एयरक्राफ्ट recently, but previously also we have given. So Dornier aircraft for basically maritime surveillance, maritime monitoring. So there are issues of common concern which makes cooperation desirable, and then there are steps taken to improve cooperation. What kind of steps? On the issue of terrorism, solidarity plus 50 million US dollars of assistance in capacity building. On the issue of maritime security, cooperation in establishing coastal surveillance radars and also providing equipments like Dornier surveillance aircrafts to Sri Lankan Navy. That is something that we have done. And then there is also number of exercises between India and Sri Lanka. What is the military exercise between India and Sri Lanka called? जब पहले दिन स्ट्रक्चर बनाया था तो मैंने लिखा था SLINEX is the naval exercise, SLINEX, and plus Mitra Shakti. Mitra Shakti is the exercise between the two militaries, SLINEX and Mitra Shakti. These are the two exercises. So now you have a example of common issues, right? Maritime security, coastal security, terrorism. And then you have examples of what India and Sri Lanka are doing together. So that's the story that you build. Why Sri Lanka is important, or cooperation with Sri Lanka is important in the context of regional security. Now moving on with this issue, this is the bilateral component of the relation. Sri Lanka is important from the perspective of, as I had suggested you, either India's Sagar approach, which is security and growth for all in the region, or neighborhood first approach, so bilateral issues. And then the extra regional issues, for example, the China factor. China factor becomes a strategic concern in India-Sri Lanka relations. China factor becomes a strategic concern in India-Sri Lanka relations. So what is the China factor? So China factor most visibly has played out in this relation, apart from relations with Pakistan, right? In what sense? So first of all, we understand that if India is interested in Sri Lanka's location generally, but also particularly because Sri Lanka is a neighbor, China is also interested in Sri Lanka's location. So Sri Lanka's location is of interest to China. right? Sri Lanka's location is of interest to China, right? For its larger interest or expanding interest in the Indian Ocean region, for Sri Lanka's proximity to India. So largely it is located in the Indian Ocean region. Sri Lanka generally would be of interest because it is part of the sea lanes of communication or trade route. If Chinese imports are also moving or exports are also moving in this region, Sri Lanka's ports would be of interest. So China is interested in the Indian Ocean region. But when it comes to larger strategic equations, its proximity to India also is of interest. Now, that's where what we find is Sri Lanka is an important location in China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. All these factors are linked with each other. Sri Lanka is located in the Indian Ocean region. So any trading country which has east-west trade would be interested in its location. Sri Lanka is close to India. So generally, China is relatively weaker in the maritime domain as compared to India, right? When it comes to Indian Ocean, India is dominant. So in the future, if China wants to become a great power, it needs to have power projection capabilities in regions beyond its shores. उसको अपने आसपास के इलाकों में के अलावा दूर तक पावर प्रोजेक्ट करने की कैपेबिलिटी होनी चाहिए, जस्ट एज द अमेरिकन्स हैव, है ना? अमेरिका, व्हाई अमेरिका इज सुपर पावर? बिकॉज इट हैज पावर प्रोजेक्शन कैपेबिलिटीज, इंटेंशन एज वेल एज कैपेबिलिटी. आपके पास इंटेंशन हो सकता है बट कैपेबिलिटी नहीं है, तो इट डज नॉट मैटर, एंड देन यू कैनॉट कंट्रोल द होल वर्ल्ड. सो फ्रेंडली रिलेशंस, अलायंसेस, दैट्स व्हाई दे आर बिल्ट, right? So in the future, proximity to India and then BRI, when China is saying that we would be connecting the world through an investment program. One is on the land, Central Asia, Eurasia, we would be building road, rail lines. In the oceans, starting from the Pacific part, South China Sea, Southeast Asia, South Asia, African coast, we would be building ports, right? Maritime infrastructure. So in the maritime part of the BRI, Sri Lanka is an important location. So that's one thing. Now what we see is in recent years, China's presence has increased. In recent years, China's presence has increased. In what sense? So there are two factors which basically bring China here in Sri Lanka. One is the 99, क्या हो गया 99? Changing political equations in Sri Lanka. Number one reason. Number two, economic needs of Sri Lanka, and number three, frictions with India, right? Frictions with India. So that is basically what is facilitating China's increasing presence in our neighborhood. There generally there has to be conducive political conditions for greater acceptability to relations with China, which we see in the case of Nepal, right? Transition in politics, there is a support to opening up with China. Then economic needs of any country would also bring or create space for China. We saw that in Nepal is a landlocked country, wants investments. And then you have periods where there are frictions with India. So all of our neighbors may have some grievances against us. We always believe that relations can be improved in a bilateral framework of peaceful dialogue. But then in these periods of frictions with India, we have found that China has a greater space. In Nepal, for example, we saw 2015 constitutional logjam. China had a greater opportunity in Nepal. right? So that is where you would see opportunity is there for China to enhance its presence in this particular region. So that's why what we can say is, or see generally, that with the rise of Rajapaksa family, relations with China, meaning relations with China in Sri Lanka, were prioritized. Relations with China were prioritized. So this is a recent phenomenon. First of all, Mahinda Rajapaksa became the president of Sri Lanka early on. Mahinda Rajapaksa, all these are brothers. Or Mahinda Rajapaksa became the president of Sri Lanka in 2005. And then you have the other brother, Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, became, ये नाम बहुत ज़्यादा important नहीं होते वैसे एग्जाम में, right? But just understand that there is a certain correlation that we are drawing. Political change का ये example है. When the Rajapaksa family came to power, it's generally seen that relations with Sri Lanka were prioritized. Why? Because this is the period when Sri Lanka mounted an operation against the LTTE. There were civil rights violations, so of course India had to criticize Sri Lanka, and no country likes its criticism. China does not criticize anyone. China does not care about human rights or anything. So China did not have that problem. China has a larger checkbook also. So China can write you a check of large sum. So China, for various reasons, was attractive. Thereby what we would see is, one example was investments from China increased in Sri Lanka, right? So what kind of investments we saw increasing? So we saw urban development projects like Colombo Port City, right? Chinese are far advanced in terms of infrastructure building, in terms of real estate building. अपना भी बहुत बना लिया है, which is now creating a debt problem in China, but generally they are experts. Americans right now would find it difficult to compete with China in infrastructure building, क्योंकि उनको इतना experience हो गया, right? Colombo Port City project, and then you have the Matala Airport, this kind of a project, and then you have the example that everybody remembers, Hambantota Port, because everybody, when they are making videos, are talking as though they are experts in maritime trade or naval experts. Experts बहुत सारे हैं आजकल, right? So Hambantota Port. And then in recent times you would see that this pattern continues. For example, Sri Lankan authorities have granted renewable energy projects to Chinese companies. So that is one marker of how gradually China, through its commercial engagements with the support of government of Sri Lanka in the context of political change and economic needs, has been able to advance its interests in Sri Lanka. So that's the example of how China increased its presence in Sri Lanka. So from that perspective, what you would see is China's interest in Sri Lanka seems to be long-term, strategic in nature. लंबे समय के लिए चाइना चाहेगा कि यहाँ पे it gets a foothold, right? So thereby what we see is, in this context, what are the concerns? We are not concerned about the development of Sri Lanka. Of course, Sri Lanka has the right. आ रहे हैं वहां पे आ रहे हैं. But still, what is your question? कौन कौन आसानी से लोन दे देता है? Who? World Bank, IMF. Go and negotiate with them. First of all, it is a very time consuming process. Second of all, World Bank funding, IMF funding would always come with conditionality. World Bank gives you development funding, IMF gives you short term funding in the case of currency crisis, liquidity crisis. But today Sri Lanka is going there or Pakistan is going there. It would take a long time to negotiate a debt package with them. Secondly, it would always come with conditionalities. World Bank would talk about your environment, World Bank would talk about your politics, World Bank would talk about your human rights. So conditionalities are always attached. And IMF would say wholesale change your economy. Structural adjustment program. क्या करो? Privatize करो. उनका solution क्या है? Privatize करो. 1991 में they asked us to do so, right? And in many other countries they have done so. So had there been satisfactory arrangements available for smaller countries to mobilize loans for their development, perhaps China would not have gotten this opportunity. See, what China is doing for me is nothing wrong. Even suppose tomorrow I become the Prime Minister of India and we have the money, I would also do that. If I identify that somebody is poor, they need money, I not exploit it. As a matter of influence, I would also do it. Right? America right now, बहुत समय के बाद $600 billion of funding का program लेके आया है G7 पे. Right? So basically why Americans are doing that? Nobody is doing anything for free. Nobody is doing anything for free. So why, एक क्वेश्चन पूछते लोग, why चाइना से क्यों लोन ले रहा है श्रीलंका? First of all, it's always a political decision. Right? If political leadership agrees, then a lot of decisions can be taken. So there may be political corruption, some people say. Second reason why, because availability of loans from alternative sources comes with a lot of conditionalities. It is time taking, right? And obtaining loan from China, China has been advancing loans easily, right? Without much of conditionalities related with political arrangements. China commercially is very tough negotiator. It would take back its money, right? It would take back its money. It would take its pound of flesh. It would not let it go. तो पाकिस्तान वालों को भी समझ में आ रहा है कि भाई पैसे तो देने पड़ेंगे वरना बिजली नहीं मिलेगी. So commercially China is tough, but politically speaking वो ज़्यादा केयर नहीं करता conditionalities के बारे में, right? So it is easier for countries to obtain loan from China because China wants to offer it. So what are the concerns? So first of all, increasing presence of China in IOR and in India's neighborhood is a strategic challenge. Why? क्यों है? इसको समझना अगर है तो बहुत ही सिंपल है. फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, in the context of already contentious relations with China. Example, tensions at LAC. तो हमारे already traditionally there are security related difficulties with China. So if China increases its presence in IOR, Indian Ocean region, and in India's neighborhood specifically, that is a strategic concern for India. It's a security challenge. China is coming close to our borders. It is a challenge because then it erodes our influence in the neighborhood, right? Contentious relations with China, and then China's rise and unilateral assertion. Meaning China, as China has become stronger, it has become, so there are traditional issues, but when we look at the conduct of China, as China has become stronger, it seems to be going, यूनिलैटरल, मीनिंग माई वे और दी हाईवे, या तो आप हमारा रास्ता मानो या हमको हमारी जो मर्जी हम वो करेंगे, हम बातचीत में ज़्यादा समय व्यर्थ नहीं करने वाले, राइट? So that is something that we are witnessing as part of China's behavior. That China's rise has been accompanied by unilateral assertion, which also means at times aggression. Right? What happened in Galwan, what happened in South China Sea. Again, I would not be surprised because this is great power behavior. As countries become strong, that is what they try to do. अपनी दादागिरी establish करने की कोशिश करते हैं, जिसको कहते हैं international relations में hegemony. Right? तो बेसिकली अमेरिकन ऑल्सो डिड दैट. अब हमारे लिए प्रॉब्लम यह है कि चाइना हमारे बगल में, अमेरिका तो 7,000-8,000 मील दूर है, चाइना इज राइट नेक्स्ट डोर. सो दैट्स व्हाई rise of powers generally is a time of tension. A power which is rising in our neighborhood creates a Game of Thrones like situation. All right? So then that is a concern, that is always a concern for us. And in specific terms, the Chinese commercial projects, if China is coming commercially, then what is happening? China's commercial projects are creating dependent economies, dependent economies on the basis of debt trap. So debt trap is an old concept in international relations. Generally, the situation when a country borrows but is not able to repay, and when it becomes a vicious cycle that a country's debt keeps on increasing without country's capability to repay. So that is basically a debt trap. A country is caught in a debt trap that no matter what it does, it is not capable of mobilizing sufficient resources to repay the debt. So country का existence किस चीज पे dependent हो गया? Debt पे. This is generally applicable in the context of African countries, right? World Bank, IMF are notorious for what they have done in Africa, right? They advanced loans to African countries, but the capability of African countries never increased. Corruption increased in those countries, right? So they became loan dependent. That is what people say. So that is what is visible in Chinese behavior also. When China is lending to other countries, it is not considering the commercial viability of those loans. These loans, this lending is not based on any sound economic principle. So that means it is based on simple strategic calculation of China. It knows that other countries would not be able to repay the loan. And when they are not able to repay the loan, it provides China an instrument of influence over them. Then China can impose conditionalities on them. So that is another concern. When China's commercial projects are coming up, they are creating dependent economies. They are creating a debt trap in our neighborhood. Countries which are in the debt trap of China. Meaning वो ज़्यादा China की सुनेंगे, ऐसा हो सकता है. Right? And then China's commercial presence is closely linked with its strategic. China's commercial presence is closely linked with its strategic goals. Right? Meaning China wants to become a great power. China wants to dominate Asia. China wants to become a global power. So when China is doing commercially anything also, that is adding to its strategic abilities. Right? And again, I would say I'm not surprised. This is what the history of great power politics has been. This is what the history of great power politics has been. I'm not saying what China is doing is right. I'm saying I'm not surprised. Right? क्यों? क्योंकि अब मैं क्लास 10th का एग्जाम नहीं दे रहा हूँ. So I understand that there are certain things which are done for the sake of saying, and there are certain things which are done with some real intent, and every country does that. Right? So commercial presence is closely tied with strategic presence. Imperialism सुना है आपने? क्या होता है? What is imperialism? Right. So basically, imperialism is a mode of domination of one country by one country of the other country, and it is generally done through इकोनॉमिक एंड डिप्लोमेटिक इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स. आपको डायरेक्टली कब्जा करने की जरूरत नहीं है उस देश में. यू डू इट थ्रू इकोनॉमिक एंड डिप्लोमेटिक इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स. कोलोनियलिज्म क्या हो गया? उसका भाई हो गया, राइट? कोलोनियलिज्म इज द कजिन ऑफ, एल्डर कजिन ऑफ इंपीरियलिज्म, विच मीन्स व्हाट? डायरेक्ट फिजिकल कंट्रोल प्लस इकोनॉमिक कंट्रोल प्लस पॉलिटिकल कंट्रोल ऑफ any people or country. So that has also been a pattern in international relations. रहा है कि नहीं रहा है? So आपने सुना है that flag follows the trade. नहीं? चलो कोई बात नहीं. आपने सुना है कि the Britishers came and established factories in India पहले, and then who came? ब्रिटेन का झंडा आया कि नहीं आया? सो फर्स्ट ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी केम, देन केम द ब्रिटिश रूल. तो पहले ब्रिटेन क्या करने आया था? ट्रेड करने आया था. फिर क्या हुआ? होलसेल लेवल पे आ गए वो. सो बेसिकली फ्लैग फॉलोज द ट्रेड. तो यही इंपीरियलिज्म है, यही कोलोनियलिज्म है. सो ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ दिस एक्सपीरियंस वी समटाइम्स think that these patterns of dominations have existed, and it is apparent in the behavior of particular countries that a newer form of domination may be in the making. तो पहले किसने डोमिनेट किया? वेस्ट ने, ब्रिटिशर्स, अमेरिकन, यूरोपियन पावर्स. अभी वही क्या करना चाहता है? कौन करेगा? चाइना. सो जनरली दिस इज व्हाट हैपेंस, राइट? एक्सप्लॉइटर, the exploited becomes the exploiter at times. Generally human beings somehow always choose morally dubious options, right? Generally human society की यही history रही है. Civilization is built, civilization becomes strong, and then civilization develops hubris, civilization develops arrogance. We are great, and then there is a downfall. So if China may seem strong today, समय का पहिया हमेशा घूमता है, बट देन जब तक समय का पहिया घूमेगा तब तक क्या क्या हो जाएगा ये हमको नहीं पता. दैट्स वाई दी कंसर्न्स. इट डज नॉट मीन दैट आज ही होने जा रहा है. जैसे पिछली क्लास में कोई आए मेरे पास, उन्होंने कहा कि ये चाइना का शिप आया हुआ है यहाँ पे, ये हमारा फेलियर है. मैंने कहा एक चीज से तो फेलियर होती नहीं, पहला एक चीज हो जाने से कोई फेलियर होता नहीं है आपका. इट्स अ प्रोसेस. लुक एट इट एज अ प्रोसेस. Look at international relations as a boring, long game of chess. T20 का मैच नहीं है, chess का गेम है. So where you basically, when you are making a move, you may have thought about that move much prior to making that move, है ना? और कभी कभी आप अपना नुकसान कराते हैं किस लिए? ताकि आगे फायदा हो. So there is tactics and there is strategy. Countries make tactical adjustments in order to gain strategically. ऐसा हो सकता है, right? So commercial presence is clearly linked with the strategic goals of China, which is becoming a great power, which is controlling its interests as much as possible. ये Americans ने भी किया. सऊदी अरेबिया में तेल है, तो इंपोर्ट करने के एग्रीमेंट की बजाय क्या किया? वहां जाके बैठ गए, राइट? सो द यूएस हैज अ नेवल फ्लीट इन गल्फ, राइट? भाई ऐसा भी तो कर सकते थे जैसे और लोग करते हैं, तेल खरीदो आप, कमर्शियल प्रेजेंस रखो, लेकिन नहीं. ग्रेट पावर्स वुड ऑलवेज लाइक टू डिफेंड देयर इंटरेस्ट, कि अगर हमारे इंटरेस्ट को कुछ हुआ तो देन व्हाट वी विल डू? वी विल प्रोजेक्ट पावर, राइट? सो दिस इज व्हाट हैपेंस, राइट? People learn from each other. China has learned from United States and has also learned from USSR. USSR वाली गलती नहीं करनी है. But China may also be making a mistake. China का जो BRI है may lead to its overstretch. China ने कैलकुलेट किया होगा, लेकिन कैलकुलेशंस अक्सर फेल हो जाते हैं. So that is the concern. And then the issue is of immediate security concerns regarding espionage, regarding espionage and surveillance by China close to India's coasts. So लड़ाई भले ही नहीं हो रही हो, but as China becomes stronger, as its commercial goals are closely linked with its strategic goals, we find our immediate concern may be that China's presence commercially also is closely linked with its intentions of securing its interest, knowing more about India's capability. So espionage and surveillance becomes India's immediate concern. Long term concern is what would happen in the case of war. अगर कल को लड़ाई होती है, और लड़ाई हमेशा कल होती है, right? So if it happens tomorrow, what would happen? So that's long term concern. If China is present here, it adds to the strength of China. Short term concern is कि वो कल के लिए आज चाइना तैयारी कर रहा है, right? Meaning whatever steps China is taking, it is strengthening its presence, it's strengthening its interest, it's strengthening its goals, right? So that's basically what India's concern is. बात अगर आपको समझ में आ गई, कहानी हमेशा शुरू होती है कहां से? पैसों से, ऑलराइट? कहानी हमेशा कहां से शुरू होती है? पैसों से, और पैसे के बाद कहानी कहां पहुंचती है? वॉर पे. सो बेसिकली डिफरेंट एलिमेंट्स. सो व्हाट वी सी इज दैट अगर आपने समझा कि चाइना फैक्टर क्या है श्रीलंका में, so just recount the story logically. One, we understand that China's location is of interest to Sri Lanka's location is of interest to China. इंडिया के लिए भी इंटरेस्टिंग है. IOR में है proximity to India and part of Belt and Road Initiative. In recent years, what has happened? China has increased its presence in Sri Lanka. So what have been the conditions which have allowed for this to happen? A, political circumstances in the country where it is happening, changing political equations. B, economic needs of Sri Lanka. Countries are in need, that's why they are borrowing. And then frictions with India. Whenever there are frictions with India, such space for China increases. That's why managing relations with our neighbors is important for us. Then what is happening when we see in Sri Lanka, generally recent decade has been a decade where the one family has dominated Sri Lankan politics. Rise of Rajapaksa family politically has meant that there has been a preference for relations with China. Relations with China have prioritized. So then what has it resulted in? It has primarily resulted in presence of China in the economic sphere of Sri Lanka, mainly in the form of large infrastructure project, Colombo Port City project, Matala Airport, or renewable energy projects, or the Hambantota Port. And then we see what are the concerns regarding this. These are the major concerns. Increasing presence of China in IOR and India's neighborhood is a strategic challenge in the context of contentious relations with China, in the context of rise of China and its unilateral assertion. And then what we see that China's commercial projects are creating dependent economies. So that's the development challenge that is there in India's neighborhood. Rather than self-dependent economies, we have dependent economies. And then this is basically referred to as debt trap, checkbook diplomacy, right? Predatory lending practices. And then when we look at this, we find that whatever China is doing politically, diplomatically, or commercially is directly linked with its strategic interests, which is China wants to become a great power. There is no two way about it. And then it raises immediate security concerns for India apart from long term. What concerns? China's presence in this region is promoting espionage, surveillance, and that is a immediate security concern. So that's why, if you see, Dr. Jaishankar was in Thailand. He was asked the question on this. China is saying that India should not obstruct the presence of its research ship in the Indian Ocean region. It is of no concern. So India says, of course we are concerned. Right? If a foreign ship with significant technological capabilities comes and docks in our neighborhood, we are concerned and we are monitoring. We retain the right to monitor this situation. तो देखो चीजें एक साथ हुई हैं. श्रीलंका allowed China to dock its ship. Then उसी के आसपास क्या हुआ? डॉर्नियर एयरक्राफ्ट दिया हमने श्रीलंका को. तो इसका मतलब ये है कि इट्स एन ऑनगोइंग प्रोसेस. इट्स अ कंसर्न. आइडियल ये होता कि श्रीलंका वुड हैव डिनाइड चाइना दी डॉकिंग ऑफ इट्स शिप. अब ये भी तो सोचो, श्रीलंका छोटा सा है, चाइना बहुत बड़ा है, चाइना ने उसकी बड़ी मदद की है, तो कैसे मना कर देगा ऐसे मुंह उठा के, नहीं 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 आपको नहीं आना यहां पे, अच्छा नहीं लगता. सो समटाइम्स you don't have the capability to say a no, right? Ideal is that it should have said no, but it was not able to say no. Then ideal is that we remain engaged with Sri Lanka. We don't give up on the situation कि अब चाइना तो आ गया, अब हम क्या कर सकते हैं. Don't give up on the situation. We remain engaged, and that is what generally keeps on happening, है ना, ये होता रहता है. So that's why when you read newspapers, what would happen? You start developing अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ द पैटर्न. आपको एक पैटर्न समझ में आने लगता है, और जिस समय आपको सब्जेक्ट्स में पैटर्न समझ में आने लगे, समझो आपकी प्रिपरेशन अच्छी चल रही है, क्योंकि आपको सिंपल टेक्सचुअल अंडरस्टैंडिंग कि ये पढ़ा और ये आ जाए सीधे एग्जाम में, से बाहर निकलना है. कहां जाना है? यू हैव टू स्टार्ट लुकिंग एट द पैटर्न्स. सीधे सीधे क्वेश्चन तो आते नहीं इस एग्जाम में, खास तौर पे प्रीलिम्स एग्जाम में. लोग कहते हैं प्रीलिम्स एग्जाम बहुत अनप्रेडिक्टेबल, बहुत डिफिकल्ट है. वो तब है, और है जनरली है, बिकॉज इट इज एन एलिमिनेशन एग्जामिनेशन, बट इट बिकम्स मोर डिफिकल्ट व्हेन यू स्टार्ट टेकिंग प्रिलिमिनरी एग्जामिनेशन लिटरली, कि ये किताब पढ़ ली और यहां से ये सवाल आ जाएगा, एंड यू स्टॉप एक्सरसाइजिंग योर माइंड दैट देयर आर कोरिलेशंस, राइट? ईदर आई नो समथिंग कंप्लीटली और आई नो समथिंग पार्शली, बट वट एवर आई नो कंप्लीटली और वट एवर आई नो पार्शली इज गोइंग टू हेल्प मी इन रीचिंग टू द करेक्ट ऑप्शन. जिंदगी भर में जो सीखा है पीछे, वो भी मेरे काम आएगा, जो अभी पढ़ा वो भी मेरे काम आएगा. दिस इज द नेचर ऑफ द एग्जामिनेशन. सो द मोमेंट यू स्टार्ट आइडेंटिफाइंग पैटर्न्स इन एनी सब्जेक्ट, पैटर्न्स इन द एग्जामिनेशन, you are better placed. That is what I would say. And here is a break. We will take a break. After the break, we complete Sri Lanka, we go to Maldives, we complete Maldives. Okay. So we have come back from the break. Please settle down, take your seats. Right, if you have settled down, let's get started. So we are talking about strategic concerns in this relationship, strategic issues in this relationship. We identified the issues where there is cooperation and there is no doubt that cooperation needs to be increased. Please settle down. Cooperation needs to be increased, we understand, and then we understand that concern comes from how China is engaging with Sri Lanka. We understood it in as structural a way as possible, as systematic a way as possible. So now you have your own understanding and you know how to write about it as well. So what is happening currently? So what we see is part of the pattern. Once you learn the pattern of relationship, you see what is happening is part of the pattern. What has happened in Sri Lanka recently? नहीं, economic crisis नहीं. Most recently, a Chinese ship has docked in Sri Lanka. क्या नाम है उस ship का? देखो, कुछ लोगों को याद होगा, कुछ लोगों को नहीं होगा. Right? Yuanwang 5 is a Chinese research and survey ship equipped with advanced electronic equipments. So the issue was that it docked in Hambantota port. All right, it docked in Hambantota port, and India had clearly conveyed to China not to allow this docking. Sri Lanka also, USA also had expressed its concerns on the docking of Yuanwang 5. And why was this? Because India looks at it as the part of China trying to establish a permanent presence in India's neighborhood, that it may lead to an established presence of China in the Indian neighborhood. That is basically what is India's concern, that it is not one-time event, but it is part of China's efforts to build a established presence in India's neighborhood. That is why India said don't do it, and India is monitoring the situation. So that is what would happen. you would always find that India would express its concerns. That is what India does. It expressed its concerns. So that's why it comes into news. All right. And then India, when if nothing else, would be monitoring the situation. So in these kinds of things, this is what happens. You convey your concern. चुप रहना अच्छा नहीं है. अगर आपको कोई प्रॉब्लम हो रही है तो हमेशा उसको वोकलाइज करो, राइट? डोंट सफर इन साइलेंस, so that anyone who is causing a problem to you at least knows about it and knows your position on that. Don't suffer in silence. Raise your voice. Individuals को भी यही सलाह देते हैं. So India is also saying, raising its concern with whom? With Sri Lanka. Raising its concerns where? Whenever there is a press conference, External Affairs Ministry spokesperson would be asked this question, so India would spell out its position. So अपनी position clear करना, अपने concerns clear करना बहुत जरूरी है. It's part of articulating your own position, and it is also part of sending a signal to your adversary that look, this is something that we don't like, and that means that if we do something like this in the future, suppose we go and dock our ship in Vietnam, or suppose we go and establish relations with Taiwan, you won't like it, so don't do it. So we are making them aware of our sensitivity. We are making others aware of our concerns. And on our own, what are we doing? Whatever we are capable of. We are monitoring the development, monitoring the ship. This is basically what happens. This is part of the process. Ideal ship should not have docked. Now it has docked. What do? You continue to engage with Sri Lanka. That is the key, right? You continue to engage with Sri Lanka, have better relations with it. And then you express your concerns as vocally as possible. So that is what has happened. So generally, Yuan Weng is for China a research ship. So generally, research ships are there in the ocean to monitor the maritime environment, all right, to map their resources, so on and so forth. There can be innocent purposes. But then we understand that right now China has a weakness in terms of ground monitoring stations for its satellites in the Indian Ocean region. आपके पास satellites हैं, but आपके पास similar ground monitoring stations नहीं हैं. तो एक comprehensive monitoring of the Indian Ocean is a weakness of China, right? It does not have significant presence in the Indian Ocean in terms of territory. It's a Pacific country. So when we look at ships like Yuan Weng 5, we understand that the information that it gathers may be relayed to the strategic satellites of China. Thereby, it is directly linked with military activities, and that is something that is a particular cause of concern. That what basically Yuan Weng is capable of, right? Better monitoring of the Indian Ocean and certainly close to India's coast. That is India's concern. So, be that as it may, we understand that in this context, some of our concerns have come to be true. So, what happened at the Hambantota port? So, first of all, Hambantota port was constructed in the year 2010 with Chinese financing. Some reports suggest that India was offered this port, but India did not participate. So some people would say India lost the opportunity, but India understood that this does not have commercial viability, right? So that is how the Chinese sell dream. China right now is a good salesman. So these projects are sold with the promise of economic development. Hambantota is the constituency of Mahinda Rajpaksha. तो कोई भी नेता क्या चाहेगा? मेरे constituency में एक बड़ा project आ जाए, right? So then Chinese found the opportunity. They sold this port with the promise of transforming economic conditions in the vicinity, that this port would become productive, it would become a hub of trade. So that's why Sri Lanka agreed, Sri Lanka borrowed from China, China gave the money, China built the port. So thereby what we see is Hambantota port did not become financially viable, right? It did not become financially viable. Why? Because for a port to become financially viable, you require certain conditions to exist. First of all, there should not be a competing port in the close vicinity. Colombo port is already an operational, large, traditional port. So there was always the possibility that Hambantota, why would people use Hambantota port, commercial vessels? So it always had Colombo port, competition from Colombo port. Secondly, for a port to be successful, ultimately ports are for exports and imports. So there should be adequate activity in the immediate vicinity. There should be adequate economic activity in the hinterland of the port. So that was also not the case, right? So Hambantota port did not become commercially viable. So that is where people started noticing that Chinese projects are not becoming commercially viable. So that means that there should be something else behind this particular project. And that is where the concerns became clear in 2017 when Sri Lanka was again facing a debt problem, right? So in that particular year, what we find is Sri Lanka found itself unable to service a lot of debt, and much of its debt by now was from China. So in 2017, China, through a debt equity swap, right, was able to get control of the Hambantota port, or control of the operations of the Hambantota port on a 99 years lease. Meaning, Sri Lankan government negotiated with China that in return of infusing some more money into Sri Lankan economy, they would be handing over the operations of the port to China for 99 years. Right? That is what happened. So Chinese companies, Chinese lenders acquired the operations of the Hambantota port. So the commercial presence of China here also then raised the same concerns as we have understood now, that it may lead to an established presence of China in India's neighborhood. And then we find that Chinese ships in the Indian Ocean have been present since 2008. Alright, 2008 onwards we see largely China getting active in the Indian Ocean region, and since then it has been increasing its presence. So there have been times where Chinese submarines have been spotted close to India's coast. In 2014, India had asked Sri Lanka not to allow the docking of Chinese submarine. When Hambantota port was handed over to China for 99-year lease, India had conveyed its concerns to Sri Lanka. India conveyed its concerns to Sri Lanka that it has strategic concerns regarding Chinese control of the Hambantota port. This may translate into the military presence of China in the region. So at that point in time, Sri Lanka had assured India that only the commercial operations of the Hambantota port are with the Chinese. Chinese are the operators of the port, not the owners. Right? They have the operations of the port for 99 years. So Sri Lanka had told India that it is only for commercial purposes that Chinese are here, and the security control is in Sri Lanka's hands. Right? So that is what basically we were conveyed at that point in time, and this is something that happens. We convey our concern, we want assurance that our red lines would not be violated. But certainly Hambantota port is part of a long-term pattern which now is visible, and the concerns are always the same and the result is also similar. Now the Chinese presence in this particular region, the Chinese presence in the region of India's neighborhood is of concern in the current context also, which means what? So if we look at the current developments, what we find is again the elements which provide China an opportunity to be present in the neighborhood, right? So here we have Sri Lankan economic crisis, and you also see that it is also ultimately a political crisis. So now can you see that whenever there is a crisis in our neighborhood, economic or political, that is an opportunity for India to be more concerned. That is an occasion for India to be more alert, because that is an occasion for other countries, other powers to have a greater foothold in our neighborhood. ये तो समझ गए ना हम? जब भी ऐसा कुछ होता है तो हमें सावधान रहना चाहिए. What are India's primary goals here? A, stability and systematic transition. That is what India wants, that it should not further lead to a deeper crisis. Whatever is happening should not affect stability of the region, and if there is a transition, it should be an organized transition, a systematic transition. That is what India would always be, first of all, concerned. So what we see is that a Sri Lankan debt had been rising, right? Sri Lankan debt had been rising. So the international debt was distributed across different bodies. So it had loans from international lenders, it has payments due for its imports, but it's very clear that as a single largest lender, China had emerged as the largest lender to Sri Lanka. It was clear that this is the situation, right? So Sri Lanka's economy then entered into a doldrum in 2020 onwards, wherein the existing situation was already rising debt to different bodies, different groups for trade, for whatever they had borrowed from groupings like World Bank or from international markets. But on the one hand, China was the largest lender. In that context, 2020 came. What happened in 2020? So, you have COVID-related restrictions. So, all of you are part of the COVID generation now. घर पे बहुत समय बिताया. That's why some of you may have forgotten that when you are in public, you don't talk the way you talk at your home or with your friends. तो थोड़ा भाषा की मर्यादा का ख्याल रखें, खास तौर पे सीढ़ी पे जब भीड़ जमा के खड़े रहते हैं, है ना? तो चलिए, तो बेसिकली कोविड रिलेटेड इकोनॉमिक रिस्ट्रिक्शंस very clearly was a burden on Sri Lanka's economy, and then you have also the health crisis. How does the state manage these two crises? It is difficult for anyone. So then what happened? Then what we find is that first of all, there was a drop in tourist inflow. That means there was a drop in the revenues that Sri Lanka used to get earlier. So tourism services sector is an important bulwark of Sri Lanka's economy, number one. And then what we find is exports also slowed down. Whatever exports Sri Lanka used to make slowed down, because generally there were global economic restrictions. And then what we find is, since there were travel restrictions also, we find that another source of Sri Lanka's revenue, remittances, dropped, meaning Sri Lankans going abroad and working and sending money to Sri Lanka, remittances dropped. So एक के बाद एक तो economic fundamentals are already problematic, and then COVID comes. So it poses economic challenges because productivity is restricted, And then whatever revenue Sri Lanka was getting, tourist inflow is a big source. Sri Lanka is a beautiful country. You must visit whenever you get time. Now I'm promoting Sri Lanka tourism. So then that happened, and then exports slowed down because there was no global demand, and then remittances dropped. And after that, you have policies of the new government, 2020 onwards. Again, the Rajpakshas came to power. So at that point in time, they basically introduced some tax cuts, right? In order to consolidate, every politician would like to grant as much as of patronage as possible to strengthen grip on power. Tax cuts, and then they had agricultural reforms. What agricultural reforms? They simply wanted to turn Sri Lanka overnight towards organic farming. ठीक है, काफी ambitious plan है, पर देखो ऐसा है, एक के बाद एक झटके नहीं लगते रहने चाहिए, right? Sometimes it happens in our country also. Reforms are good, but there should be some concern for the speed. कितना reform हो सकता है, right? So tax cuts, agricultural reforms, then they also added to the economic conditions. So what happened 2020? Sri Lanka faced liquidity crisis, right? By 2022, Sri Lanka faces economic collapse, right? So earlier it was only a problem, and then it became a crisis, and then it became a complete collapse of the Sri Lankan economy, right? So then in these kinds of occasions, what would happen? So of course, China provided help to Sri Lanka, but this is an opportunity when India also stepped up. 2020, India provided 400 million US dollar of line of credit to Sri Lanka, 100 million US dollars of grant. India facilitated help to Sri Lanka from the SAARC currency swap mechanism. So basically India also steps in these kinds of situations. This is also an opportunity for India. As much as it is an opportunity for others, it is an opportunity for India also to do what? To establish itself as the credible development partner of its neighbors. It is a matter of credibility, whether you are able to help your neighbors in the times of crisis or not. So India had helped Sri Lanka. 2020, 400 million US dollars, so line of credit, 100 million US dollar grants, currency swap through the SAARC arrangement. So India also provided currency swap, provided dollar support to Sri Lankan economy. 2022, we are saying that so far we have provided 3 billion US dollars, 3 billion US dollars of support to Sri Lanka, 3 billion US dollars of support to Sri Lanka. That is something that has happened so far. What kind of support have we provided? We have provided a support for energy, meaning we initially provided 500 million US dollars of LOC, line of credit for energy imports. That is something that we did, and then we provided 1.5 billion US dollars for import of essentials, right? So that is what we have been doing in tranches so far. The official sources say that India has provided 3 billion US dollars of support to Sri Lanka, right? We also have deferred payments for imports, but we cannot do that much because then Indian importers would suffer. So that's why we provide money, loan to Sri Lanka, that you pay for the imports that you are making. So that's basically what India is doing so far in this particular context. It is understood that right now Sri Lanka's loan is more than 51 billion US dollars, Largest lender is China. 7 billion US dollars worth of loan Sri Lanka has to repay in the short term. So Sri Lanka is yet not out of crisis. The solution is it has to negotiate an arrangement with IMF, right, for bailout, for getting foreign currency loan, and that process is still going on. So that is going to be an unfolding process. मतलब ये होता रहेगा आगे, आप पढ़ते रहेंगे अखबार में. Sri Lanka wants India to be a guarantor, all right? That when we are talking with IMF, can you put in a word for ourselves? And that's where India becomes important. Its influence elsewhere may be of use here. So that is another opportunity for us, because others would be doing it. China has also provided over these years, 2020, 22, 21, 22, around 5 billion US dollars of support to Sri Lanka, right? It has. But India always is considered to be the closest first responder in the context of crisis in Sri Lanka. This is what is happening. This is the unfolding situation. And you just keep an eye on what has happened, but more importantly, what is India doing there, right? Rather than looking at what others are doing. So thereby, we have come to a stage when we can talk about what should India do in its relations with Sri Lanka, how to manage this particular relationship, because transition would always be there, some sort of economic crisis would always be there, China would always be there, but that does not mean that we would not be there, right? We are there, Sri Lanka is there, that geography is not going to change. So first of all, like other neighborhood relations, India should leverage the factors of geography and culture, right? That's the simplest formula that you have. So first of all, leveraging geography means better connectivity. Leveraging culture means utilizing Buddhist heritage, promoting people to people ties. There is no substitute for this, right? Connectivity can mean better air connectivity, better ferry services, in this case, maritime connectivity with Sri Lanka. Secondly, there should always be an effort to strengthen economic engagements. There is no substitute for this. So, most importantly, India's development support to Sri Lanka must be utilized to establish India as a credible development partner of Sri Lanka, right? We need to consistently ensure that we have credibility as a development partner, that Sri Lanka trusts us as a development partner. Now, economic engagement would also mean moving towards a balanced trade, right? So that may mean expansion and revision of existing FTA, free trade agreement. This is something that should always in general be India's effort. Economic engagements mainly focusing on development support to Sri Lanka, and then if possible making progress in trade, expansion of the existing FTA, addition of services and investments. That has been India's goal. Now when we move forward, we understand that China is an important part of the equation, but we need to strengthen our engagements with Sri Lanka. That is the answer to China. So first of all, India needs to participate in the infrastructure investment in Sri Lanka, because that is where right now the competition is. The world is witnessing. आज से 5 साल पहले 2015 में मैंने स्टूडेंट्स को कहा था, पे फोकस टू connectivity and infrastructure as key elements of foreign policy, and generally that pattern has held. BRI आया, अब अमेरिका क्या कह रहा है? That it would also support infrastructure investing. That simply means that there are so many small countries across the globe, developing, least developed economies, who just don't have enough money to support their own infrastructure development. So that means there is a large gap there, right? There is World Bank and IMF, but they don't have sufficient capability to support infrastructure projects. Private sector lender are always wary of investing in infrastructure. They are also there. Countries provide ODA, they are also there. But then right now the need is to have a consolidated approach towards infrastructure investing. So infrastructure investment in Sri Lanka. So we had signed a project called Colombo Port East Container Terminal project, right? So that is basically one project that the Sri Lankan government had cancelled in 2020. 2018 we had signed it with the help of Japan. So we must focus on reviving, possibilities of reviving the project must be explored in the current context. Colombo Port East Container Terminal project, right? Colombo Port East Terminal Container project. So these kind of projects should be revived, right? Then we have the oil farms project, right? Oil farms project around Jaffna. So that is something that we should implement in the quickest possible time. And then you have projects where India is involved. For example, the KKS Harbour project. KKS Harbour project, Kanke Senthurai Harbour in the northern parts of Sri Lanka. This is another investment project that India is invested or interested in. These kinds of projects provide India a foothold. So revival of the East Container Terminal project should be a priority. There should be implementation of oil farms project, KKS Harbour project, and then there are strategic projects like India is interested in the operations of the Matala airport, because Matala airport again is a airport that was built with great promise that it would bring a lot of business. It is today called world's loneliest airport. It has not been successful, but built by China close to the Hambantota port. So India has been interested in the commercial operations of the Matala port. तो इस पोर्ट के ऑपरेशंस को एक्वायर करने की कोशिश करनी चाहिए हमको, और बेसिकली ये जो है एक स्पेसिफिक फोकस होना चाहिए. Here we must strengthen our own capability by partnerships, right? So either under the umbrella of G20, G7 or US, most importantly Japan, and now Australia is also interested and is a friendly country capable of investing in infrastructure in South Asia. So we must focus on partnerships in infrastructure building in South Asia, because akele we don't have the sufficient funds available to build or invest in infrastructure. So partnerships in South Asia for infrastructure building, right? G7, G20, they are involved and have announced their own initiatives for infrastructure. US is there, which now is keen on supporting India in South Asia. So this is a friendly country that we have right now. Then we have Japan. So the ETCA project in 2018 was signed with Japan. Japan was also a partner in this particular project. So Japan is a partner, and Australia, lesser talked about country, but Australia is keen on partnering with India in South Asia on infrastructure. So these partnerships should be a focus of India when it comes to infrastructure projects in South Asia. What else should we be doing? We should be generally looking at initiatives that promote India's interests. So in terms of security cooperation, initiatives like Colombo Security Conclave. Colombo Security Conclave had started in 2011 as a trilateral dialogue between India, Sri Lanka and Maldives. Now it has other members like Mauritius. So this is a maritime security dialogue that needs to be strengthened, and we should ensure that India sponsored initiatives take a lead in the Indian Ocean region, because China also is keen on developing an Indian Ocean based grouping, right? So we are the leaders here, so we should try and strengthen initiatives like Colombo Security Conclave, and also utilize our presence in IONS, IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association, and BIMSTEC to advance our interests, right? IONS, Sri Lanka is also part, Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, IONS. IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association. And BIMSTEC, Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation. So that is the regional groupings that we should be promoting, right? Similarly, we have participation in Quad initiative, and that is simply because we have already mentioned cooperation with US, Australia and Japan. So forums like Quad also become relevant. So for example, we may try to expand the engagement of Quad in the form of Quad Plus. So Sri Lanka right now is nowhere linked with Quad. There is a conception of Quad Plus, 4 countries plus others. There have been dialogues. So Quad Plus, in the conceptualization of Quad Plus, we can think about bringing in Sri Lanka, right? What we can't do alone, we should try and do in partnership, right? So that is what we should try and do and think in the context of Sri Lanka. And then we should leverage policies that we already have. So we have something called Project Mosam. Project Mosam is a historical and cultural project in the Indian Ocean region that Ministry of Culture had launched in the year 2014. So this is an ongoing project which is basically about exploring the linkages in the Indian Ocean region. So we must also bring focus under Project Mosam on Sri Lanka. So इनमें से बहुत सारी चीजें और जगह पे भी अप्लाई हो जाएंगी. Whenever you are talking about Indian Ocean region, think of these, right? These are regional organizations where we are there. In Colombo Security Conclave, India is closely participating with Sri Lanka. And then there are larger global arrangements where India's partnership with these countries can be useful. And then there are India's policies, which may be largely for the Indian Ocean region, but you can use them specifically in the context of Sri Lanka, right? Focus on Sri Lanka under Project Mosam. It's a cultural project, cultural historical research of engagements in the Indian Ocean region. So that's how. अब जब आपके दिमाग में सवाल आए कि how should we counter China? So first of all, think of in what sense you want to counter China. If you want to counter China in the neighborhood, the best formula is to have good relations with your neighbors. Good relations would mean better diplomatic engagements, better economic engagements, better people to people and cultural ties, better connectivity. These 4 things are very important in the neighborhood, and for different countries you may have different examples, but that is the formula. You do what? You strengthen your relations with your neighbors. Now suppose you start talking about countering China in the Indian Ocean, then comes your strategy. Strengthen Andaman Nicobar, strengthen cooperation in IORA, cooperate with countries in terms of establishment of coastal surveillance radars, so on and so forth. तो कहां पे चाइना को काउंटर करना है, किस इशू पे काउंटर करना है, इसका जवाब हमेशा उससे आता है. नेबरहुड में ये ऑप्शंस है. स्ट्रेंथन करें अपने रिलेशंस दूसरों के साथ. और दूसरा हमेशा एक चीज याद रखना, पार्टनरशिप्स. व्हाट काइंड ऑफ पार्टनरशिप्स आर पॉसिबल, राइट? कैन यू एक्सपैंड एग्जिस्टिंग पार्टनरशिप टू फोकस ऑन साउथ एशिया? क्योंकि सिंपल बात है भाई, द वे चाइना कैन राइट चेक्स, वी कांट, वी डोंट हैव दैट कैपेसिटी. सो देन वी कैन ओनली फुलफिल दैट गैप थ्रू partnerships. This is called balancing, right? Internal balancing, external balancing. Internal balancing means स्ट्रेंथन योर ओन इकोनॉमी, अपने लोगों को पढ़ाइए, लिखाइए, हेल्थ इंश्योर कीजिए, इकोनॉमी ग्रो कीजिए, एम्प्लॉयमेंट दीजिए, मिलिट्री मॉडर्नाइजेशन कीजिए. दिस इज इंटरनल बैलेंसिंग. एक्सटर्नल बैलेंसिंग, मेक पावरफुल फ्रेंड्स, ताकतवर लोगों से दोस्ती कीजिए. दैट इज बेसिकली द फॉर्मूला, सिंपल फॉर्मूला फॉर एवरी relation that we have. Now let's quickly talk about India and Maldives. India and Maldives. So when we talk about India and Maldives, again this is a small country and this is the last country in the neighborhood that we are going to talk about. So what is the content of this relationship? So significance of Maldives, we have already understood. What is the significance of Maldives? The significance of Maldives comes from its location. Maldives is known as a toll gate between east and west parts of Indian Ocean. Meaning, if there is a passage from east to west, west to east in the Indian Ocean region, you would have to pass close to Maldives. So that's why it is important from the perspective of its proximity to sea lanes of communication, from the perspective of its proximity to trade routes. So what makes Maldives important is location. We can think of a question that in the case of Maldives, it's not the size of the country but its location that makes it important. All right, that's a simple understanding. It's not the size. So generally you focus on larger countries, समझना आसान होता है क्यों important है. But in the case of Maldives, Maldives is Asia's smallest country in terms of land and in terms of demography. Population wise, geographically it is Asia's smallest country. But location wise, it is much more important. Similarly, if we look at Maldives, it is part of what are called small island developing states. Small island developing states are important when it comes to climate negotiations. So you have the concerns of developed countries, you have the concerns of developing countries, but you also have a grouping called SIDS, Small Islands Developing States. They also are a consolidated groups in the climate change negotiations. So if you are thinking of India's leadership, think that if India can shape global rules, that would also bring value to India's role globally. So here partnerships with countries like Maldives becomes important. Maldives is a small island developing state, meaning when the sea surface rises, you folks would not worry, right? Because you come from a large country. बड़े देश से आते हैं आप लोग. मुंबई वालों को शायद चिंता करनी पड़े. In any case, Mumbai is inundated every monsoon. So when the sea surface rises, any minor change in sea surface rise or sea surface level would inundate a country like Maldives, right? So that's why Maldives represents a unique voice in international climate change negotiations. Similarly, Maldives' services sector, meaning it's small, but it is an important destination for tourism, right? It's important globally for tourism, right? And then Maldives is part of certain organizations like IORA, like SARC, like IOC, OIC, not Indian Oil Corporation, but OIC, right? OIC, Organization of Islamic Countries. So then, as a regional partner also, Maldives as a friendly country can be a support to India. In its services sector, if it is a global tourism hub, then there are a lot of Indians working in the services sector of Maldives, right? A lot of Indian groups are operating hotels and spas there. So that is basically what consolidated, in a consolidated manner, makes Maldives important. Its location, its role in international politics, its membership of different organizations. So thereby what we see is Maldives is a focus of India's neighborhood first approach, and then it is also a focus in India's Sagar approach. So Maldives is important because it is India's neighbor. Maldives is important because it is strategically located in the Indian Ocean region. Thereby, what we see is that India and Maldives have had cordial relations for most part. For most of the period of their engagements, relations have been cordial, right? Close political and diplomatic ties are there. Can you give an example? When we say political and diplomatic ties, क्या कहते हैं हम, क्या मतलब है? नहीं, विदाउट वीजा नहीं है भैया, हर जगह विदाउट वीजा ही चले जाओगे. अभी कुछ दिन पहले Maldives was in news. क्यों? Because the president of Maldives was visiting India. Close diplomatic political ties would either mean dialogues and agreements or would mean frequent visits at the highest level. So this relationship has been marked by close political and diplomatic ties, right? Here we say that Maldives has a policy called India First, right? Maldives has a policy called India First. So we can say that in the current era, India's neighborhood first and Maldives' India's first are complementary to each other. There is convergence between India's neighborhood first and Maldives' policy of India first. So that is another meaning of diplomatic and political ties. So that is there. Now let's simply look at some bit of a history. Maldives became independent in 1968, right? किससे independent हुआ भाई? The Britishers, right? So it gained independence from the Britishers in 1968. And then 1978 onwards, it was ruled by a leader called Maumoon Abdul Gayoom, right? And in this period, now Mr. Gayoom was an authoritarian leader. Election नहीं होते थे. He was as the strong man of his country. But there was a period of political stability. In this period, India and Maldives enjoyed close relations, right? So here, example of close relation is in 1988, you have something called Operation Cactus. All right, Operation Cactus. Indian paratroopers flew to Male, which is the capital of Maldives, and saved the government of the day, which was facing the threat of a coup, right? Some disgruntled elements from Maldives, some militants from Sri Lanka, they had conspired together and they wanted to overthrow the government. Mr. Maumoon was flying to India, was about to come to India, but he realized there is a coup attempt. He called India, and then India dispatched its military assistance to Maldives. Generally, India is not in favor of direct deployment of its military, but in some cases it has done so. This is one, Operation Cactus of 1988. Now what we find is that in 2008, we find that there is, तो हर authoritarian ruler का time आता है, the circle of time, powerful people fall. So constitution comes into existence in Maldives, right? There are agitations in Maldives, that things should change in Maldives, that is what people are saying. So there are changes. And then you have 2009 onwards, a new president, Mohammad Nasheed, who is the Speaker of the Parliament of Maldives right now. So Mohammad Nasheed comes to power. Mohammad Nasheed also maintains the trajectory of the relations, right? The trajectory of relations is maintained under Mohammad Nasheed also. Close relations between India and Maldives. Then comes the period of change. In 2012, Mohammad Nasheed is deposed. there is a coup in Maldives. He is pressurized, threatened to resign. He resigns. And then there is a political crisis. Political crisis. 2013 UPSC had asked a question on this. The implications of the political crisis for India's interest. So this political crisis then for the most part is seen to be associated with the rule of the next president. Next president of Maldives is Abdullah Yamin. Mr. Abdullah Yamin, then in this period what we see is there is a tilt towards China. So the concern in this relation is visible in this particular period, right? There is political crisis. Now the president who replaces Mr. Nasheed, Mr. Yamin, is getting close to China. So we see in 2017, for example, China and Maldives signed a free trade agreement. India did not know about this free trade agreement. Then Maldives makes changes in its land laws, which means that a company which is investing $1 billion US can acquire land holding in Maldives. So changes in land laws, investment laws is made in such a way in Maldives that it opens up the possibility of China acquiring land in Maldives. So that is something that happens. In this period, Maldives endorsed China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. And you would also find that in this period, for the first time, China appoints a diplomatic representative to Maldives, meaning China is now focusing on Maldives, and China's infrastructure investments. इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर इन्वेस्टमेंट्स, मैं जो बोल रहा हूँ वही लिख रहा हूँ, तो जिनको भी परेशानी हो रही है पढ़ने में, जो बोल रहा हूँ वो भी फॉलो करो, यूज ऑल योर फैकल्टीज. सो इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर इन्वेस्टमेंट्स by China in Maldives also increases, and this is something that causes concern. So on the one hand, proximity to China is very clear. On the other hand, we see that some steps detrimental to India's interests are taken. So GMR, सुना है आपने GMR? What is GMR? नहीं, GMR तो you are murmuring, but what is GMR? It's an important infrastructure company in India, logistics company in India, the one which operates Delhi airport. All right. So only few airports in India are now operated by anyone apart from Mr. Adani. GMR is one of them. All right. Privately operated airport, majorly controlled by the Adani Group. GMR, Delhi airport, is controlled by the GMR Group. So this group had been awarded a contract in 2010 to build an airport at Malé, capital of Maldives. So under the new government, what we found was the 2010 contract to GMR was cancelled. So India's commercial interests are hit. It's another thing that GMR won an arbitration later and it was compensated. And then what we find is Indians start facing visa difficulties, meaning there are various hotels, services sector in Maldives. Indians used to regularly apply for jobs and Indians were working in this particular sector. Suddenly Indians had jobs but they were not granted visa. है ना, इंटरव्यू वगैरह क्लियर हो गया लेकिन जाने को वीजा नहीं मिला. So visa related difficulties started appearing in that some Indians started facing visa related difficulties. And then in 2018, this is the culminating period, Maldives asked India to take back its helicopters. So India had provided some helicopters, aircrafts for Maldives, Maldivian Coast Guard as a capacity building support. Maldives said, हमको नहीं चाहिए, ले जाओ. So that is outrightly saying that you are not welcome here. So that is a concern that emerged in this particular relationship. Maldives asked India to take back its helicopters that India had provided. So now here is the case of a government which is in a sense openly hostile to India's interest. So in that context, what should India do? Some people said, for example, Mohammad Nasheed said, India should intervene, India would be welcomed as a liberator. Meaning people like Mohammad Nasheed wanted India to directly intervene. India did not intervene because it is not a guarantee that if we change a government somewhere, the government would not turn against us. We cannot always ensure the outcomes. कि भेज दिया military और वहाँ की government change कर दी, तो कल को उसका वो result favorable होगा ऐसा जरूरी है नहीं. Americans को देख लो, they send military everywhere but they are popular nowhere. So that is something that we did not do. Secondly, some people said that we had sent our military in Operation Cactus. So that the logic was that at that point in time, the government of Maldives had asked for help. This time, an opposition figure is saying that he should help. So those options were not available. And then the best option in most of the situations for India is, as Prime Minister Narasimha Rao had said, in some situations, not taking a decision is the best decision. All right? In some situations in life, no matter what you do, you would not be able to find an optimal solution. So, क्या करें फिर patience रखें. Not taking a decision means wait and watch. So then the issue was resolved after 2018 with the election of the new president, election of Mr. Ibrahim Solih. So in 2018, elections took place in Maldives and Abdullah Yamin was defeated in the elections. Ibrahim Solih won the elections, and then what happened? Then we see that since then India-Maldives relations have been on the upward trajectory. So PM visited Maldives in that particular year to participate in the swearing-in ceremony of Mr. Ibrahim Solih. And then at the same time, the President of Maldives visited India. President of Maldives also came to visit India. Right? So on that occasion, after that, India announced a $1.3 billion of assistance to Maldives. $1.3 billion. So at that point in time, people said that this is approximately equal to what China's debt to Maldives is, right? So $1.3 billion were announced, and thereby you would see what India is doing in Maldives is something like this. India is implementing infrastructure projects like Greater Malay Connectivity Project, meaning India is building a strategic bridge between different atolls of Maldives, connecting it with the capital Malé, Greater Malay Connectivity Project. Similarly, India helped Maldives in building the composite defense training facility. Composite defense training facility. So, training facility for Maldivian armed forces was built by India after this. India announced connectivity projects. So, ferry service. So, closest state to Maldives, where you go to Maldives, where you go to Kerala. What is the capital of Kerala? Thiruvananthapuram. You will always find Maldivian people in Thiruvananthapuram. So, ferry service with cities like Kochi was announced by the Prime Minister that we would be connecting with Maldives better. So, ferry service. And then you have India also promising that it would help in building a cricket stadium. Mr. Ibrahim Solih came to India, he watched an IPL match also. Right? So, we said let's build a cricket stadium. So, cricket stadium. So, various development projects amounting to $1.3 billion have been announced by India. Similarly, India in the context of defense announced providing Dornier aircraft to Maldives for Maldivian coast guards, and Maldives is one place when India inaugurated a coastal surveillance radar system. So that has been inaugurated, coastal surveillance radar system. So in this sense, what you would see is that when Mr. Soli came to India, he said India first. India said neighborhood first, so Maldives is the focus. 2019, Prime Minister went to Maldives again, and then he was awarded the highest civilian honor of Maldives. Highest civilian honor of Maldives was awarded to the Prime Minister. So generally we can say that there is an upward trend focusing on development cooperation by India, 1.3 billion US dollars of commitment, and defense capacity building support to Maldives. Similarly, we see that again here, Colombo Security Conclave is again a platform that had started in 2011 as a trilateral dialogue between Sri Lanka, Maldives and India. So Colombo Security Dialogue Conclave has become fairly regular now, where India interacts on defense matters with Maldives. And then we also have signed a white shipping agreement with Maldives, which means exchange of information on commercial ships. If the ships are moving in the Indian Ocean, where are they coming from, where are they going, what are they carrying? This is an important information. India monitors Indian Ocean region. So when we have coastal surveillance radars in other countries where we are helping with them, and we sign a white shipping agreement, which means the other country has the capability to monitor its own side of the ocean, and we have the facility of exchange of information. So it helps us in expanding our reach in the Indian Ocean region. So signing of a merchant shipping or white shipping agreement. White shipping is a reference to merchant shipping, civilian shipping, right? So merchant shipping agreement, white shipping agreement was signed between these countries. So that's where we can see by and large the relations have come back on the track. Today what we are witnessing is a campaign in Maldives called India Out campaign, India Go campaign, India Out campaign in Maldives. So generally it is part of what happens in our neighborhood, domestic politics. This is seen to be supported by the former president, Mr. Abdullah Yamin. So basically, when somebody is out of power, they would always blame India. For example, when Mr. Rajpaksha lost the elections, it was said that India's RAW intervened in the elections. So currently there is an India Out campaign. It is part of domestic politics of Maldives. It is traditionally seen to be associated with the personality of Abdullah Yamin, who is traditionally seen to be close to China. So then what can we do in this situation? We can do this. 2022, President of Maldives came to India, professed India first policy again. Abhi aaya na Maldives ke president. So that is what we can do. Strengthen our relations with that country across what matters? Across the matters of development, connectivity, across the matters of defense, right? And also people to people ties, greater number of scholarships, medical facilities for the people of Maldives in India. This is called developing interdependence. When countries are dependent on each other, you fulfill some of our interests, we would fulfill some of your interests. Free mein kuch nahi hoga, right? So that is the answer to this kind of a situation. When there is, so what happens in these kind of situations? Generally the opposition blames the government that you have sold the interest of our country to India, right? India is intervening or is being allowed to intervene. India's military presence is increasing. So we don't say anything on that because it would further complicate the matter, right? We don't interfere in the domestic politics of any country. The logical culmination also always comes through time. For example, 2012 to 2018 period ultimately ended with an election in Maldives. So let the people of Maldives decide. If Mr. Yamin comes to power, then we will make an attempt to have good relations with him. right? We will try to convince him, or we will try to give him a deal which he can't deny, right? So basically, this is something that goes on. This is India-Maldives relations, which has come to an end. Thankfully, the relations with the neighbors is over. If you have any questions, more than welcome to raise those questions. Some people are active in the online chat forum, so they keep on asking questions. So one question is, can countering Quad be another reason why China wants to have greater presence in IOR? So, जो लोग बोर हो रहे हैं वो घर जा सकते हैं, right? But let me address some of the questions. Unless you have a question, you can ask. So Adishwar asks, can countering Quad be another reason why China wants to have greater presence in IOR? So primarily that is yes, true, but primarily China wants to expand its interests. So any country, first of all, would do anything to advance its interests, commercial and strategic interests. Secondly, it wants to increase its presence in IOR to strengthen its position vis-a-vis any number of actors which it sees to be adversarial. So it can be Quad, it can be US, it can be Japan. It primarily wants to become stronger in Indian Ocean, because without being strong in Indian Ocean, it cannot truly become a global power, right? आप Pacific power हो सकते हैं, but जब आपकी एनर्जी और आपका ट्रेड इंडियन ओशन से आ रहा है, so primarily it is important that you are able to increase or enhance your strengths in the Indian Ocean region. Difficulty with China is that it is not geographically present here. अमेरिका के साथ कंपटीशन करते हुए चाइना भूल जाता है that America is endowed with a very very fortunate geography, है ना? अमेरिका के दोनों साइड क्या है? Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean. So first of all, this is a domain that America has conquered quite early. America has early mover advantage, meaning who has the largest fleet of aircraft carriers? United States. All right. System of alliances, location in different parts of the world, United States. So United States was able to develop as a superpower because it was first of all geographically safe. ऊपर कनाडा था, नीचे मेक्सिको था, दोनों ऐसे नेबर हैं जो बहुत ज्यादा यूएस को थ्रेट कर नहीं सकते. सो वंस यू हैव दैट, व्हाट यू गेट इज फ्रीडम टू रोम. जब आप घर में सुरक्षित हैं, आपका घर सुरक्षित, तो आप क्या कर सकते हैं? फ्रीडम टू रोम. फिर आप पूरी दुनिया भर में घूम के तबाही मचा सकते हैं, राइट? दैट इज बेसिकली अ फैक्टर इन इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस. So US has freedom to roam. That is how it became great power. Now China wants that. So China's first problem is Pacific. China's second focus is the Indian Ocean. Indian Ocean is a focus because still China's major energy imports. China के पास सब कुछ है, oil and gas नहीं है. इसका मतलब ये नहीं कि बिल्कुल नहीं है, but not sufficient. So its oil and gas energy imports are still coming from West Asia, Africa. And for that, it needs to secure those supplies. And then its exports, its markets are also towards Asia, but also towards Europe. So that is something that it wants to defend. So China is thinking in a very straight-jacketed manner. China thinks that tomorrow, if the competition worsens, what would happen? Any adversarial forces would first of all cut off its energy supplies, which is coming from the Indian Ocean region. So that is what China is thinking about the future. So basically to strengthen its interest, but also to ensure that no adversarial forces, including if Quad can be seen as that, is able to adversely affect China. That's basically the answer to your question. That's one reason, right? If you have, I want to ask that have we any issues related to fishing with Maldives? I am not aware of any issues related with, certainly not aware of any issue of note on fishing with Maldives. Because see, Sri Lanka is very, very close when you look at the Pak Bay. Very, very close. With Maldives we have a certain degree of distance. So there is space. So I am not aware that there are any fishing issues unless Indian fishing boats are going there and doing something. Rohan asks, sir, does we follow UNCLOS on sea in Pak Bay? Why is there dispute on maritime boundary? So remember, UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, provides you the principles on the basis of which you can determine rights and obligations in the oceans. So of course, India is a signatory of UNCLOS, and the basis of its maritime boundary demarcation generally is UNCLOS principles, right? India has also its own maritime domain legislation, right? So its domestic legislation plus UNCLOS inform India's policy on the maritime sphere. In the Pak Bay, there is no dispute on maritime boundary. So in class also, those of you who may have thought that we may have a dispute on maritime boundary, it's not a dispute on maritime boundary. It's a dispute on how that maritime boundary is being violated in the course of fishing by fishermen. So there is no maritime boundary dispute, there is only a dispute over the fishermen, right? That's something that you should understand, right? Now, what we need to do is next moving towards regional integration in South Asia. That is what we are going to talk about, right? We have talked about individual relations, bilateral relations. Let's simply talk about regional integration in South Asia. So first of all, regional integration. What is a region? Region simply is countries located in a contiguous geography, right? So if you have different countries sharing a contiguous geography, you can imagine it to be a region. So what are the regions in the world? You have South Asia, where we live. This is our region. You can think of Southeast Asia as a region, right? Countries of Southeast Asia, geographically contiguous. You have Central Asia, countries of Central Asia, countries of West Asia. So generally, this is a larger conceptualization of a geography. What we are sharing is geography. Now, this is a potential. This potential can be realized for mutual benefit through the process of integration, right? So we have regions, which simply is geography. That is something that you are given. Now, how do you manage this geography? So one way is keep on fighting, right? One way of managing the geography is keep on fighting wars. Another way of managing the geography is unite in some ways. So integration simply is a process of developing closer cooperation on issues of common interest. So when you are talking about regional integration, you are primarily talking about developing cooperation on issues of common interest, and that can be any number of things. It can be trade, it can be political decisions, foreign policy, right? So developing cooperation on common issues of interest, and this can also be seen to create interdependence. That integration can create interdependence, and when countries are interdependent, you can prevent conflicts, prevent wars, right? So international relations as a discipline is about one question: why do countries go to war, and how to prevent it, how to build a peace system. That is why international relations as a discipline, first of all, came into existence, right? So international relations, the history is not very long. It emerged as a discipline in the British universities at the early part of 20th century. The question was war. Why? Look at the history of Europe, or look at human history anywhere. Most important examples through which we understand history is wars. किसने किससे कहाँ लड़ाई की थी, right? पोरस के सिकंदर से लड़ाई. So हिंदी फिल्म में गाना है ना, सिकंदर की पोरस से हुई थी लड़ाई तो मैं क्या करूं. आप ये करें कि आप पढ़ें उसको एग्जाम के हिसाब से. So generally that is an important question. Now यूरोप, अब यूरोप आप देख ले, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, 30 year war, क्राइमियन वॉर, है ना, वर्ल्ड वॉर वन, वर्ल्ड वॉर टू, मतलब सब कुछ करके देख लिया, सब कुछ करके देख लिया. Prussia wanted to rise, German unification happened, alliance systems arose, सब करके देख लिया. रिजल्ट क्या निकला? फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर, मास डिस्ट्रक्शन ऑफ यूरोप. और यूरोप क्या, हमको भी ले आके वहां पे लड़वाया उन्होंने. सो वी कमोमोरेट द लॉस ऑफ लाइफ ऑफ आवर ओन सोल्जर्स हु पार्टिसिपेटेड ऑन बिहाफ ऑफ ब्रिटेन इन द वर्ल्ड वॉर. सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर, पहला वर्ल्ड वॉर करके नहीं माने, सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर अगेन लार्ज स्केल डिस्ट्रक्शन. पर अब यहां पे अमेरिका ने न्यूक्लियर वेपन का इस्तेमाल कर लिया, तो लोगों को समझ में आ गया कि शायद अगली बार मौका ना मिले. ऑल राइट, सो देयर बाय यू वुड सी one question is war, countries go to war, and then some people say countries not only go to war, countries also engage in other kinds of activities like trade. So is there a way in which countries can coexist as independent countries and yet not go to war? So some people started saying if we can develop cooperation in such a way when countries have stake in each other's well-being, interdependence, then perhaps war can be prevented. So that's why you would see regional integration emerging after the Second World War. And you have multiple examples of regional integration. For example, the regional integration process in Europe, perhaps the most successful example of regional integration, European Union. You have the example of in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, SAARC तक आएंगे, तभी तो ये बैकग्राउंड बना रहे हैं. अभी सार्क है, आसियान नहीं, नाटो तक मत चले जाओ. नाटो इज नॉट अबाउट रीजनल इंटीग्रेशन, नाटो इज अ मिलिट्री अलायंस. ऑल राइट, नाटो इज अ मिलिट्री अलायंस. और नाटो ही कहना है तो नाफ्टा कह दो. व्हाट इज नाफ्टा? नॉर्थ अमेरिकन फ्री ट्रेड एग्रीमेंट विच क्रिएटेड अ फ्री ट्रेड एरिया बिटवीन मेक्सिको, यूएस एंड कैनेडा. It now is known as US Canada Mexico Agreement. तो ये एग्जाम्पल्स है आपके रीजनल इंटीग्रेशन के, राइट. एंड यू कैन हैव अदर एग्जाम्पल्स ऑल्सो. हाँ हाँ, सार्क पे आ रहे हैं. मैं जो बार बार इधर से आवाज आ रही है सार्क 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 पे आ रहे हैं भाई. पहले थोड़ा समझ तो लो कि ये हुआ कैसे है. जल्दी है सार्क जाने की. सार्क में ही बैठे हो अभी. इंडिया इज पार्ट ऑफ सार्क. So basically, how can regional integration take place? Generally, it has taken place through economic route, right? So you have, if you see EU, what was the first step that Europeans took to unite? They created European Coal and Steel Community, all right? European Coal and Steel Community. So meaning they identified the core industry, core area of industrial activity at that point in time in this part of Europe. So Ruhr-Rhine region was important for the purpose of coal, and steel industry of Europe was also located in this particular part. So then European Coal and Steel Community brought together countries like France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Italy, West Germany together to formulate common policies in governing this industry. Right, so that is how integration starts, when you can identify an area which is of common interest, and then you can try and frame common rules, right, so that all of you benefit, right. And then after that, what has happened? You have creation of a common market in Europe. European Union moved towards creation of a common market. Entirety of members of European Union became one market, right. It also is about creating a customs union, meaning now this part of the world is trading with other parts of the world on the basis of common rule. Europe is one market. When you export, you are exporting to European market, right? Maybe the product is going to a specific country, but you are trading with them on the basis of a common rule, which they have decided they would apply. So in their relation with each other, they have abolished border controls. In their relation with the rest of the world, they trade on the basis of common rules. So creation of a common market, creation of a customs union, and then at the extreme, it can be also about common monetary policy. Generally, countries don't want to give control of their monetary policy, which means what? Printing of currency, right? So you have in Europe a monetary union also. You have what is called Eurozone. 19 countries of Europe use euro as a currency. So that means in human experience, this is also possible. Can you think of a day when India, Pakistan, all countries of South Asia use the single currency? ना you can और can't think, किसी ने सोचने से आपको नहीं रोका है. नो कह दिया आपने, सवाल थोड़ी ना पूछ रहा हूं मैं, पूछ रहा हूं can you think of? So that shows limitation of your imagination if you say no. Today not possible, but if you look at America, यूरोप के लिए भी तभी पॉसिबल हुआ जब उन्होंने पहले 300-400 साल आपस में लड़के देख लिया. All right, so today in South Asia we have only been fighting for 75 years. अभी 75 years और लड़ सकते हैं, 150 years, उसके बाद रियलाइज करेंगे that it is not beneficial, right? यूरोपियंस ने भी ऐसा किया है. साउथ एशिया में इमेजिन करना मुश्किल है, ट्रू, बट दैट्स वाई यू हैव वर्ल्ड हिस्ट्री. हिस्ट्री से आप यही सीखते हैं कि ह्यूमन बींग्स क्या क्या कर सकते हैं. ऐसा मत कहिए कि ये नहीं हो सकता. क्या किसी और ने किया है, क्या कहीं और हुआ है? In Europe, it has happened on the backdrop of Germany and France were never best friends. Right? Never best friends. Europe always faced one problem. What was the problem? How to contain this Germany. Whenever Germany gets strong, other countries feel threatened. So World War I, World War II, you tried. You imposed peace on Germany, it did not happen. Then you decided Germany को economic पार्टनरशिप का हिस्सा बना लेते हैं. When Germany is part of economic prosperity of Europe, well, it would think twice before creating any instability. So generally, this is how economic integration takes place in a particular background, in the context of a common geography, in the interest of a common issue, countries coming together. When you take an area like economy, it can happen through arrangements like PTA, preferential trade agreement, then FTA, then customs union, then you may have common market, then you may have monetary union. ऐसा हो सकता है. PTA, preferential trade agreement, you start trading on the basis of preferential tariff in some goods, some commodities, limited free trade agreement. Free trade agreement generally opens up the trade with liberalization of tariffs in the extensive range of goods which are traded, right? Customs union, now you trade with others on the basis of common rules. आपने खुद common rules decide कर लिए which applies on every country. So harmonization of rules may also happen. And then you can develop so much of trust, then you decide that we have common currency, right? It may happen. But currently, South Asia has not even crossed this particular stage. So that is the status of regional integration in South Asia, right? So when we look at South Asia, it is generally considered to be a latecomer in the process of regional integration, right? That's one. So the platform that South Asian countries built to promote regional integration, called SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, came into existence only in 1985, whereas we have the process of creation of European Union dating back to 1951. ASEAN came into existence in आश्चर्य करने की बात नहीं, आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट कोल एंड स्टील कम्युनिटी, देन यूरोपियन कमीशन, देन यूरोपियन यूनियन, प्रोसेस शुरू हो गया वहां पे. आसियान केम इनटू एग्जिस्टेंस इन 1967. साउथ एशिया वालों को ये बात थोड़ा देर से समझ में आई. 1985 they decided to form a regional organization called SAARC, right? So SAARC's secretariat is in Kathmandu. Now when SAARC came into existence, SAARC has 8 members and 9 observers, So when SARC came into existence, it was the idea of smaller countries. All right, smaller countries. Which smaller countries? Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives. They were the countries which were in favor of creating a regional organization. Right? Bangladesh primarily took the lead, organized conferences, proposed the idea, and then in 1985, SARC was created. Now, when we look at the formation of SARC, what we find is its creation itself happens in the context of bilateral contentions and lack of trust between countries. These countries are very sensitive about their sovereignty. Kuch bhi keh do, they would always talk about sovereignty and territorial integrity. All right, very sensitive. So how do you then develop common cooperation? Smaller countries thought that if they have such a platform, they have a stronger bargaining position vis-a-vis India. India के साथ better bargain कर पाएंगे. India is a larger neighbor, right? Pakistan thought if SARC is created, India would dominate it, है ना? So Plato में एक cave allegory है. Or in Indian tradition there is a story of wise men who were blind and they are touching an elephant and describing an elephant. So everybody looks at the world from their own vantage point. So Pakistan thought India would dominate it. India thought this is smaller countries ganging against me. Right? So all of them fashionably want to integrate, but they have their own sensitivity. Smaller countries, better bargaining with India. Pakistan, India would dominate. India, they are ganging against me. But in that context, SARC still comes into existence. So, if you see bilateral contentions, mainly India, Pakistan, for example, or other countries, lack of trust, and above all, sensitivity on sovereignty. ये सोवरेनिटी टर्म जब स्टूडेंट सीखते हैं तो मैं समझ जाता हूं कि हर क्लास में ये इसके बारे में बात करने लगते हैं. प्रॉब्लम इज दैट यूरोपियंस इन्वेंटेड दिस टर्म, फॉट ओवर इट एंड गॉट ओवर इट. दे गेव इट टू साउथ एशियंस. अभी साउथ एशियंस इस पे लड़ेंगे, फिर 150 साल बाद समझेंगे कि चलो इतना भी कोई चिंता करने वाली बात नहीं, इतनी आसानी से सोवरेनिटी कॉम्प्रोमाइज नहीं होती, तो कर पाएंगे कोऑपरेशन. सो SARC कम्स इनटू एग्जिस्टेंस इन दिस कॉन्टेक्स्ट. A history of colonialism, post-colonial state, sensitive on their sovereignty, more inward looking. Bilateral contention, that is a part of their history of their relation, and that means that there is an overall lack of trust. In this context, SARC comes into existence, and we bring the class to a close. बहुत सारे लोग बहुत ज़्यादा relieved हैं, but in the next class, in this background, we will be talking about how to look at SARC in the current context, the problems, the achievements, what India thinks of SARC, and then what other options are there for regional integration. That's what we will be doing in the next class, and hopefully we will be starting China in the next class, right? Thank you very much.